The unsolved murder of Dorothy Jane Scott. Dorothy Jane Scott was an ordinary woman living an ordinary life until she became the victim of a terrifying and mysterious murder that has haunted her family and intrigued investigators for decades. Born on April 23, 1948, in Anaheim, California, Dorothy was a quiet and kind-hearted woman, a single mother who dedicated her life to raising her 4-year-old son, Sean. She was described by those who knew her as a devoted and caring mother who rarely dated and spent most of her free time either with her family or in church. Dorothy worked as a secretary for two jointly owned stores, one selling psychedelic items, and the other a head shop, located in the city of Anaheim. She was known to be a responsible and reliable employee, living a life that was largely uneventful and private until strange things began to happen that would change her life forever. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Dorothy had been receiving strange phone calls from an unknown man. The caller's voice was both terrifying and obsessive, alternating between expressions of love and threats of violence. Dorothy's son, Sean, and her parents, with whom she lived, heard her speak about these disturbing calls, which were becoming more frequent and sinister. The caller reportedly claimed to be watching Dorothy at all times and would often give detailed descriptions of what she was wearing or doing when he called. He would tell her things like, "I'm going to get you alone, and I'm going to cut you up into bits so no one will ever find you." Though deeply frightened, Dorothy tried to carry on with her life, refusing to let the strange calls paralyze her with fear. She even took self-defense classes, hoping to protect herself if the threats ever turned into actions. However, Dorothy's fate took a darker turn, and she wouldn't have a chance to defend herself against her stalker. On May 28, 1980, Dorothy attended a work meeting at her job in Anaheim. During the meeting, one of her coworkers, Conrad Bostron, appeared unwell, and Dorothy, along with another colleague, Pam Head, decided to take him to the emergency room. They rushed Conrad to the UC Irvine Medical Center, where doctors found that he had been bitten by a black widow spider, a serious but treatable injury. While waiting for Conrad to receive treatment, Dorothy and Pam stayed in the hospital waiting room together. Dorothy at one point went to the restroom and, while she was there, used the time to retrieve her car from the parking lot so it would be closer to the hospital entrance for when Conrad was ready to go home. When Conrad was discharged at around 11 p.m., Pam and Conrad walked out to the parking lot, expecting to meet Dorothy, but she wasn't there. Suddenly, they saw Dorothy's white 1973 Toyota station wagon speeding towards them with the headlights blinding them, then quickly speeding away from the hospital lot. At first, they thought she had some kind of emergency and would return soon, but she didn't. That would be the last time anyone saw Dorothy alive. The next morning, Dorothy's car was found abandoned and on fire in an alley about 10 miles away from the hospital. There were no signs of Dorothy anywhere, and her family was left distraught, wondering what had happened to their daughter. For weeks, there were no answers until the phone calls began. Shortly after Dorothy's disappearance, her parents, Vera and Jacob Scott, began receiving horrifying phone calls from a man who claimed to have Dorothy. The anonymous caller would say things like, "I've got her," or "I killed your daughter," and hang up. These calls came at irregular times, but often enough to torment the family. Despite the phone company's efforts to trace the calls, the stalker always managed to hang up before a trace could be completed. The police believed that the caller was likely Dorothy's abductor and murderer, but they had no solid leads or evidence to prove it. The calls continued for years, always tormenting the family, but never providing answers. Vera Scott would answer the phone, hear the terrifying words, and have to live with the knowledge that whoever had taken her daughter was still out there. Even the police became frustrated, unable to stop the relentless harassment. On August 6, 1984, over 4 years after Dorothy vanished, a construction worker discovered human bones near Santa Canyon Road. The skeletal remains were quickly identified as belonging to Dorothy Jane Scott through dental records. Next to her bones was a turquoise ring and a wristwatch that had stopped at 12:30 a.m. on May 29, 1980, just hours after she disappeared. There was no evidence left at the scene that could point to her killer, and the mystery surrounding her death deepened. Dorothy's family was devastated by the discovery of her remains, but the nightmare wasn't over. Even after her body was found, the mysterious man continued to call the Scotts, taunting them with vague and horrifying remarks about Dorothy's fate. The phone calls would continue for some time before eventually stopping for good, leaving her family with no closure. The investigation into Dorothy's murder has remained unsolved for over 40 years, with multiple theories emerging but none leading to any concrete answers. The police were convinced that Dorothy's stalker and the anonymous caller were the same person and that he had likely been someone she knew, or at least someone who had been watching her closely for some time. One theory is that Dorothy's killer could have been someone she knew, possibly a former lover or acquaintance who became obsessed with her. However, Dorothy was known to have lived a quiet, private life, and no one in her circle seemed to fit the profile of the type of stalker who would have harassed her so relentlessly. Theory number 2. Given that Dorothy worked in a public-facing job at the head shop, some speculated that the killer may have been a customer or someone who frequented the store. This theory seemed plausible, as the anonymous caller knew specific details about her life that suggested he had been following her movements. Another theory is that Dorothy may have been the victim of a serial killer, who preyed on women in Southern California during the late 1970s and early 1980s. There were several unsolved murders of women in the area around that time, and some investigators have wondered if there could be a connection. However, no clear links have been established. Dorothy Jane Scott's murder remains one of California's most chilling unsolved cases, not just because of the brutal and mysterious circumstances of her death but because of the horrifying phone calls that terrorized her family for years afterward. The case became notorious for the way in which the killer taunted the family, prolonging their agony and the media frenzy surrounding the story. Her parents never stopped searching for answers, though they passed away without ever knowing who took their daughter from them. To this day, Dorothy's murder remains unsolved. The case has become a grim legend among true crime aficionados, a story that represents the darker side of obsession, stalking, and unsolved mysteries. The eerie phone calls, the fire, the chilling remains discovered years later, it all adds up to a puzzle that has haunted both her family and investigators for decades. Despite numerous investigations, there are still no leads, no suspects, and no answers. This tragic and mysterious murder remains one of the most haunting unsolved cases in American history. If you liked our mystery, give us a subscribe in order to receive weekly updates.